Welcome to Global View. Today we have an extraordinary guest, a journalist, an author, a lawyer, someone whose work has raised to international recognition for his reporting on Edward Snowden revelation, exposing the mass surveillance by the US government. Thanks for joining us, Glenn Greenwald. Sorry about my accent.
No, it's not an easy name for anybody. It's great to be with you guys.
Mostly for me. Thank you so much for being with us. So I would like to start revisiting the Snowden revelation and comparing them to the intelligence community's role in Russiagate. In particular, when Snowden leaked the NSA surveillance programs in 2013, it exposed how intelligence agencies were spying on American citizens under the guise of national security. Now, fast forward to Russiagate, we saw elements of the intelligence communities actively involved into shaping political narratives, media coverage, and even starting investigation on the Trump campaign. From your perspective, since you're an expert in this, what do you see as the biggest difference between the intelligence overreach in Snowden that Snowden exposed and how agencies operated during Russiagate?
I think the most important thing to remember is that when this part of our government was created, which was in the aftermath of the World War II, it was created by the National Security Act under President Truman in 1947. They understood that this was a very radical departure from how we had previously conducted our government, because it was going to be this significantly secretive, out of kind of democratic accountability realm. And the idea was we need to do that to compete with the Soviet Union and to ward off communism. The taboo that was embedded in this world from the very beginning, from its inception, was that we're going to allow this part of our government to exist, to do covert operations. The limitation, though, that was absolute was that under no circumstances could its powers ever be directed inward domestically. It would always have to be directed at foreign adversaries. And this is something that is indoctrinated into the brains of every person who goes and works for the US security state. Following 9/11, a series of orders that were issued in secret and sometimes not even issued at all by the White House, just undertaken by these agencies, was to start using these eavesdropping devices and the surveillance technology and these secretive authorities, not only externally, but also internally. And you had a lot of whistleblowers in the post 9/11 era, not just Snowden, but people like William Binney and Thomas Drake and others, who said, I went to work at the US security state thinking that they would never direct these powers inward. And then I saw that they were, and that's why they became whistleblowers. And the concern was always that, and this is when we get to Russiagate, was that the more they direct these powers inward, the more capable they are to start interfering in and manipulating and shaping our internal political discourse, our elections. And so to me, Russiagate was the culmination of these threats that had long been gathering, that people like Edward Snowden were trying to warn about, that if we allow these security agencies to start focusing on our domestic politics and our domestic population, the level of abuse is virtually limitless.
Well, that really explains how basically they evolved from surveillance to actually shaping and getting involved in political discourse, as you pointed out. Yeah, it's very interesting. Thanks for this very informative answer.
Glenn, about Edward Snowden, obviously this name has come up numerous times during the recent confirmation hearings, especially of Tulsi Gabbard and other potential cabinet members. The question really is Edward Snowden a traitor or a hero? Where do you stand on this particular question?
I don't really think it's that difficult of a question. And the only way it becomes a difficult question is by people saying things about him that just aren't true. So I'll just give you two examples. I think a lot of people have come to believe that Snowden released all of this information. The reality is that Snowden himself never released anything. He could have. He had this gigantic archive of some of the most sensitive documents that the US government possesses. Think of all the things he could have done with that. He could have sold it to foreign adversaries or to non-state actors and gotten extremely rich off of it and then moved to some foreign state and lived the rest of his life very, very comfortably. He could have secretly passed it to American adversaries, just like spies in the past that tried to harm the United States did. He didn't do that either. He could have dumped it all on the internet. He could have just uploaded it all to the internet without the slightest concern for what was being revealed. He didn't do that either. What he did was he came to American journalists, particularly myself, who was working with The Guardian at the time, and Laura Poitras, who had a deal to do this reporting with the Washington Post. And he gave us this archive based on a series of conditions that we had to agree to in order to get it. where he was being extremely conservative about the kind of information that he wanted us to publish. And he was very adamant that we first go to the government and let the government make an argument about why they believe the information shouldn't be released. Not that we would always believe the government, but we would at least give them the chance to persuade us. And in a couple of instances, they did persuade us not to publish material we were ready to publish because they convinced us that it would be dangerous. And he was very adamant that we only publish things that are in the public interest and nothing that might expose the identities of covert agents or anything like that. So he released this information in the most careful way he possibly could have, with the sole goal of ensuring that American citizens understood what their government had done in the dark, because all of this was done without the knowledge of the American public, let alone even the people in Congress. And that doesn't mean that the American people should know about every technological tool used by the NSA to spy on people. If that were the case, people could defend against it. Other countries could replicate it. But the fact that the NSA had turned the internet into this limitless mass surveillance instrument was, of course, something that the government had the right to know. That's one thing. The other thing is, typically, it's often said that, oh, he went to China and then he went to Russia and he took refuge in Americans' enemies. Neither of those things is true. Snowden knew that in order to meet with us and give us this material, he had to be in a safe place because he had no idea what the government knew he had done. He wanted to make sure that we got the material so we could report it. So he chose not to go to mainland China. He went to Hong Kong because it was a symbol of resistance against Chinese repression. It was a place where they had all kinds of protests every year in defense of civil liberties. And to him, he found that to be a very appealing symbol. And then when he left Hong Kong, because the U.S. government was close to getting him and wanted to put him in prison for life, his plan was to go to South America to seek asylum. He passed through Moscow, and the Obama administration, and they boasted about this in books, purposely trapped him in Russia by bullying the Cubans to withdraw their guarantee of safe passage and by invalidating his passport. So they trapped him in Russia. They wouldn't let him leave Russia. He had no valid passport. He couldn't get out. And then they used the fact that they trapped him there to say, oh, look, he's in Russia. That probably means he's a traitor. But if you look at what Edward Snowden actually did, the information that he released, the way in which he released it, I don't think there's much of a question about what his motives were.
I think that's so important how you laid that out, because in this age of 2-minute snippets in the media and narrative creation, people think the old narrative, especially members of Congress. You have people like Senator Graham, others, the hawks in Congress, the Senate, who really have this myopic, narrow-minded viewpoint of what Edward Snowden is, what Julian Assange really means to the world. So it was very helpful that you actually were able to clarify not only how did he transmit this information to journalists like yourself, but also how the Obama administration prevented him from getting to a safe spot in Latin America, and why he really remains in a adversarial country, if you want to call it that, Russia today. So thank you for that, Glenn.
Yeah, I would just add, he didn't choose to be in Russia. And I'm sure you saw this, George, this was, I've done reporting before that was in the news, but this is the first time when I did something that was really kind of a main headline around the world media focus. And when that happens to you, and I know I don't need to tell you this, and you have firsthand knowledge of what the media is talking about, that's when you really see the extent to which they're willing to lie, they're willing to spread information that's false, that the way they say things so authoritatively that they have no idea is true, because you're in the middle of it. You have firsthand knowledge of it, so you know for sure when the media is saying things, you know that they're lying. And you're watching them do this, and even though if you may not have a lot of faith and trust in the media before, there's no substitute for being kind of at the center of a media story. As I said, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you this, where you see just the full extent of how often and how casually and readily they lie and spread disinformation.
Well, what's very interesting, let me just a follow up on this, Glenn, because on Russiagate and the attempt to actually get real information out to what should be intrepid investigatory journalists like we had in the 70s, like yourself, some people that broke some of the biggest scandals during the Vietnam War era, some stories that you've broken, obviously, that have been massive. In my own experience, which is quite fascinating and maybe unique, I hope it's not unique, when I would try to release particular information that went against the establishment narrative, especially on Russiagate, the CIA's interference, foreign intelligence interference, that has all come to light now regarding the 2016 campaign, the attempted coup against the Trump administration, journalists would willfully suppress this information and only release information that obviously was spoon-fed to them by the establishment, the military-industrial complex. So the question I have to you is, how did we evolve from journalists being fearless, intrepid, wanting to release stories like we had during the 70s, during the Vietnam War, stories like you have released, to now seeking to constrain and suppress information that goes against the narrative? Can you explain that evolution?
Yeah, I think we have to be a little bit careful not to romanticize the past, though I do agree it has been much better. And you can point to a lot of stories that were done, investigations that were done that probably wouldn't get done now, at least not within corporate media.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back, for example, to 2002, 2003, there's always all this debate. Is the New York Times liberal or are they conservative? Is the media liberal or conservative? I don't really see it through that lens. Maybe on cultural issues, you can say they're liberal. But to me, what the US media has always been is sort of a mouthpiece for the establishment, a mouthpiece for the US security state.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people have forgotten that the reason the Bush administration was able to sell the Iraq war, the neocons through the Bush administration, based on this falsehood that Iraq had a WMD program, was on the verge of getting nuclear weapons, was in an alliance with Al-Qaeda. It's not because Fox News sold it, although they did, but conservatives already would have supported that because it was a Republican administration. It was the New York Times and the New Yorker and all of those outlets that every day were publishing stories based solely on the claims of anonymous intelligence officials that the newspapers or magazines were not bothering to check, and they were circulating it and laundering it and ratifying it as though it were true. And the New York Times obviously had a lot to account for once it turned out that there were no mass weapons of mass destruction, since they had put on their paper, the front page of their paper every day that there was. And they said the mistake that we made in this mea culpa they notoriously published by their editors in 2004 was that we were far too credulous of the claims of intelligence officials, especially ones not willing to put their names on the record, and we will never make this mistake again. Fast forward to Russiagate, and I remember so well in the middle of the 2016 campaign, the first time I ever saw the Hillary Clinton ad with this kind of sinister baritone saying, "What does Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have to hide?" You know, it was a strip right out of like McCarthyism, kind of this crusted script that came from the CIA. And I watched every one of these media outlets endorse it over and over and over and over again with no critical thinking. There was no evidence ever presented. And of course, when Robert Mueller went to look for it after 18 months, he couldn't find it because it was never there. And they just did the same thing. So I think they had a lot of bad practices that were tempered by a lot of good reporters and a lot of good practices. And then once Trump emerged, they convinced themselves, the corporate media did, that he was such a grave and singular and existential threat to all things decent that they no longer had a journalistic function that had been completely subordinated to what was this higher calling, which was a political function to just stop the Trump campaign. And then once he won, destroy the Trump presidency, even if it meant lying. And the minute journalists start thinking that way, the profession is irrevocably corrupted.
Well, and talking about that, we have seen how intelligence agencies influence corporate media. Let's think about the story of the Hunter's laptop, right? 51 member of intelligence agencies suppressing a story which was pivotal right ahead of election. Now, you have broke in the last decades one of the most compelling stories, telling us a lot about how intelligence agencies work and the influence and impact they have on surveillance and also on media. We know now that intelligence agencies control corporate media as well. And as an independent journalist who have been critical both on the right and left side of the media, what do you think is the future of platform like Substack or Rumble? Do you think this is we should shift to independent platforms so that will save themselves from the control of these intelligence agencies, or it's something like likely to happen, or the pattern to bold and fearless journalism is even more difficult than that?
Yeah, I think the last 8 years demonstrated how there's almost no cause more important, at least in my view, than preserving the ability of independent journalists and commentators and analysts to be able to speak and report and analyze freely, principally over the internet, because not only is that the primary means by which most people now get information, but it's also the equalizer. You know, 10 years ago, even 15, 20, 25 years ago, in order to reach a lot of people, you have to be able to buy a huge television studio and own a cable network or get access to television networks, or you had to own a printing press and be able to deliver them to people's doors. Now, for very little money, you can produce a kind of show like you guys are doing right in front of me, and that I do every night, that is very similar in quality to what those major corporations can produce, but also have gained a lot more trust and faith and confidence in the public, because these corporate media outlets have squandered their own credibility because of what I just said, and everybody watched them do it and can see that they do it. The public is not dumb. The public understands what the media's function is. I do have concerns about independent media. That too can have its own pitfalls. It's susceptible to all kinds of hidden influences. There's a problem of audience capture. If you rely upon a set of subscribers or donors and they have a certain political agenda, you might be afraid to challenge that political agenda for fear of losing the financial support. So it comes with its own challenges as well. But what I think, even if that's all true, what we needed more than anything was some kind of instrument for taking away the monopoly on information distribution and news dissemination that these large corporations had, because they proved so definitively that they will abuse that power if there's nobody to challenge them. And that is why you see in the West this very concerted effort to impose censorship, to prevent dissenting views from being heard, because these ruling class establishment centers understand what I just explained, that this is a real threat to their ability to maintain control over the discourse and therefore behavior. And they're doing everything possible to crush the freedom that is necessary for those to thrive. And that's why, for me, that's one of the most important causes, if not the most important.
Well, talking about censorship, just follow up about that, what happened recently in Brazil. Do you want to comment on that? And can these measures be adopted in other countries?
Yeah, it's really interesting because Brazil in the last 10 years has a very similar trajectory to what the United States has, by which I mean that you have this ruling class in Brasilia that had ruled the country for 20 years. The party of the former leftist, or the current leftist president, Lula da Silva, who had also been the president from 2002 to 2010, governed the country basically for 16 years straight. And as people became more dissatisfied, angrier at the establishment, they turned to a right-wing populist candidate who was able to present himself as an outsider, which was Jair Bolsonaro, just like Americans turned to Donald Trump for very similar reasons. Not because the country suddenly became right-wing. Again, this was a country that voted for the Workers' Party for 16 years, but because they came to hate the establishment so much that they turned to somebody who was credibly presenting himself as an outsider, just like Trump did, just like Bolsonaro did. And I was concerned about Trump in the beginning. I thought a lot of his statements were inflammatory. I thought some of his policies were potentially dangerous. And I certainly thought the same thing about Bolsonaro. And what I saw quickly, both in Brazil and the United States, was that however menacing or concerning some of their views might be, far more dangerous was the reaction of the establishment that united in order to crush it, even though that those movements had both come to power because of democratic elections, because people wanted them. And I began to see that the anti-democratic impulses were much more with the ruling class and with the establishment to hold on to the power that they knew they were losing. And censorship became this cherished instrument. And it's much greater in Brazil. There's no history of the First Amendment in Brazil. There's not really such a strong belief in free speech. You already have hate speech laws of the kind that you have in Europe, and even more so. And the Supreme Court in Brazil, in particular, has taken upon itself to just institute a widespread censorship regime where it's not uncommon for people who support the Bolsonaro movement or former President Bolsonaro or critics of the government to be censored, to be harassed by law enforcement, and even to be imprisoned and exiled. And it all came to a head because Elon Musk was getting censorship orders, every day, including of elected members of Congress. And when he decided he didn't want to comply, Brazil just cut off X in all of Brazil. And it's very similar to what happened with Rumble, which is where I have my show. Rumble decided they weren't going to comply either, and Rumble's not available in Brazil any longer. So you see this sort of, growing threat of censorship. And what's happening is you have Western Europe, Canada, the United States, Australia, Brazil, the rest of the democratic world, and each one is always going a little bit step further and a little bit step forward, and each one is seeing that as a green light to also go forward every time one country does it and succeeds. Brazil banned X just days after France arrested the Telegram founder Pavel Durov in a major escalation. So you see how these things feed on themselves, and that's why it's such a concern to me.
The United States Constitution has a First Amendment that countries like Brazil don't have. So, what differentiates this attempt to suppress free speech in the United States vis-a-vis countries like Brazil, potentially in Europe and in Asia and other countries around the world? How can America remain the last bastion of freedom of speech with this concerted global effort to suppress content, free speech, and dissenting opinions in this environment we live in today?
It's a hard question, but also I think one of the most important ones. It is true that the presence of the First Amendment in the United States makes it mildly more difficult to impose the sorts of censorship regimes of the kind we see in Western Europe or the UK, in Australia and Canada, certainly in Brazil, where you don't have that constitutional and legal impediment. But also, it's not just the First Amendment. It kind of creates a culture in the United States where we're taught from birth, basically, that free speech is the sacred value, one of the things that distinguishes us from other countries. The problem is twofold. One is that you're now seeing all of these pressure points on the big tech companies that operate political discourse. You saw the Biden White House badgering and harassing and coercing and demanding that Facebook and Google and Twitter censor all kinds of dissent during COVID, but also during the war in Ukraine. And these companies really aren't able to resist because the federal government is so powerful and they need the federal government for so many other parts of their business that they're not really able to resist that kind of pressure, even though it's supposed to be unconstitutional. And then at the same time, you have these non-governmental sectors of power, like the media and like the younger workforce on which these companies depend that tend to be very left and very liberal. And at the same time, academia that are all collaborating and uniting to demand that these companies censor more and saying, if you don't censor this and you don't censor that, it means that you have blood on your hands. And then the other problem is that if the EU gets away with imposing these censorship regulations, there's only one internet. It's not like there's an internet in Sweden and an internet in Australia and an internet in the United States. If these companies are forced to censor to be in compliance with the laws of all these other countries, that censorship will contaminate the United States because it's too expensive to build a separate internet or one that has completely different rules for Americans. And so this censorship trend can contaminate the United States, notwithstanding the First Amendment.
Well, the pendulum has swung. Obviously, President Trump is in office. He seems to be a free speech absolutist to the extent possible. So the question really is, how can these big tech companies basically have this schizophrenic approach to free speech, where one administration, Biden, wanted to suppress free speech or censor critical information. Now you have President Trump who wants free discourse and X to be the arbiter of free speech and the global public square. So how can they square various presidents? And moving forward, if we have another president who wants to censor again, and after him or her, we have one that wants free discourse. So how will they square this? Are they basically going to have particular policies for particular presidents, or will there be a more coherent approach to this very disturbing suppression question that we're facing today?
Yeah, first of all, I think we have to be a little bit careful because a lot of people raise the banner of free speech and decry censorship when it comes to defending the right to express views with which they agree. I have seen a lot of efforts in the United States, certainly prior to Donald Trump, but also now with the new Trump administration, for example, to impose what I consider some pretty repressive rules around criticizing Israel, labeling all kinds of valid views about the Israel-Gaza conflict anti-Semitic and trying to censor it on that ground. So how much free speech there is under the Trump administration, I think remains to be seen. But to your broader point, and it even connects with that point I just made, which is that is the problem, which is that on the one hand, big tech companies are extremely powerful. Facebook and Google and Twitter often have more power than even the most powerful governments. We saw that when they all unified to ban Donald Trump from using their platforms, even though he was the sitting elected president of the United States. something that caused a lot of even European leaders who hated Donald Trump to object to because of how threatening that is, that you have these big tech companies that can just decide who can and can't be heard, quite apart from any democratic accountability. The other problem, though, is that because these companies do so much business with the United States government, Amazon and Facebook and Google all have massive contracts with the CIA and the Defense Department for cloud services and a whole bunch of other things. They're never going to want to alienate the federal government. They're never going to want to make enemies of the United States government. And that's why you see this sudden transformation of Mark Zuckerberg the minute, Donald Trump is in office and he starts saying, oh, censorship was wrong and we need more masculine energy and we're going to take out tampons from the men's room. There's very clear, obvious political opportunism that corporate executives generally have because their duty is not supposed to be to a political agenda, but to be to the maximization of the profits of their shareholders. And I do really worry that if there's censorship in the Trump administration or in a future one, these companies are going to mold themselves to the demands of the government. And that's what these governments are trying to do, is get more control over these big tech companies precisely so they can dictate what can and can't be heard.
Well, and also we have seen X. Do you think that Elon Musk buying X has improved free speech on this platform?
I do think it has improved free speech on this platform because you have somebody who bought X at a value that everybody agreed was too high if it were just an economic calculation. And he did so by waving the banner of free speech absolutism. And he defined that as being any speech, as long as it's not illegal, should be permitted. And that is a really important principle. The war that he started in Brazil over free speech, the one you referenced earlier, where he confronted the Supreme Court, he eventually backed down. And now that's why X is now available again in Brazil. But still, these battles that he's been waging have been extremely important for making countries and societies question the extent to which censorship has become acceptable and the dangers of that. So I consider it a net good. There's been a lot of censorship, though, on X since Elon bought the platform that deviates from the principle that he laid out. I don't want to justify it, but the reality is he has a ton of pressure from many different directions. He owes, $20 billion to banks, and advertisers aren't going to advertise on X if he allows Kanye West to come on and say, I love Hitler, even though that's not illegal. So we banned Kanye West. These kinds of pressures are going to happen everywhere. But if somebody is banging the table and saying, in general, I want to fight for the right of people to express what they believe, even though Elon has succumbed to himself to censorship temptations, including against critics of his, which is worrying. But on the whole, I think it has been a very important step toward revitalizing the debate.
And it's actually very interesting when we look at alternative source of information, like these independent platforms like Rumble, Substack, or let's say YouTube, of course, shadow ban and the platform much content. But to me, it's even more important educating people to use information, to actually have a critical approach to information. And when I see the landscape, media landscape in America compared to Europe, because I'm from Europe, of course, I realized that it's like a channel talking in an eco space. Like there is not much intersection and space for confrontation. When I watch Fox News, I hear a version of America. When I watch MSNBC, there is another version of America. So why do you think it's so polarized? And this, I think, has nothing to do with information itself. It has most to do with the way to make information. And I think it would be much more interesting to crossover debate, not only on the presidential campaigns when we see them debating on stage, but simply even from people that are believing different things. So I would love to merge this world rather than talking to your audience, my audience, and all telling each other a different story.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it goes back, I agree with you completely. And it goes back to what we were describing or what we were talking about earlier when I was saying there are pitfalls in independent media. If you look at most independent media shows that are doing very well, they're very readily identifiable as being either on the right or on the left, or at least pro-Trump and anti-Trump. And because there's so many choices now, anybody who has a certain strongly held political view can go and find a program or a series of programs that speak to them from a shared worldview, and they never have to really be bothered with having that challenged or questioned or confronted. They don't have to hear arguments against it. And it's a very tempting thing to offer. And it's always going to be a successful business model, because if you can just, it's kind of like preaching to a choir in a church. There's something people love about that. And there's something beneficial about that, being able to gather with like-minded people and kind of reaffirming the things you really believe. That's always going to be attractive. So I think, one of the things that I've always tried to pride myself on is that I have a very ideologically diverse audience. And as a result, my audience understands. Sometimes they're going to hear things they really agree with, and other times they're going to hear things they really disagree with. I try and make sure that I'm willing to talk to pretty much anybody. And I do. I talked to someone on the far left one day and somebody on the right the next day. I've always tried to do that precisely because it is healthy in the way that you say, but that is an incentive in independent media to say, and it's a profit motive too, to say, I'm going to sit in this corner. All you're going to hear is pro-Trump content from me all day long. I'm going to cheer Donald Trump. I'm going to cheer everything that he does. I'm going to attack the Democrats every day. And there are a lot of people who are going to want to hear that, which is okay, as long as there's other things taking place within this space too. And I don't think we have enough of it. I agree with you completely. Though, again, I do think it's a big improvement from just having a small handful of large corporations dictate all the information we get to hear.
Thank you.
Glenn, wanted to shift the discussion to, maybe not shift it, but actually maybe add to the discussion regarding USAID and their tentacles globally. And if you have followed, let's say, right-wing X or right-wing media over the last week or so, what USAID is being portrayed as is a covert CIA psyop that is basically funneling money from the Democrat Party to instigate coups abroad and then to send money back into the coffers of the DNC and other Democrat campaigns. Can you explain to our audience what the truth about USAID really is and whether they are the nefarious group that has been portrayed by the right, or if they're the bastion of liberty and promoting democratic ideals as those on the left have discussed? What is the truth, and can you square that for our audience? Thanks.
Yeah, it's one of the bizarre things about our political discourse that it's now the American right that is highly critical of the part of the government that carries out foreign policy goals, and it's the American left that goes and marches in defense of U.S. aid. I mean, it's bizarre. Let's begin with the fact that USAID is an agency funded by the U.S. government in order to spread the tentacles of the United States government into other countries all around the world. It just stands to reason. It doesn't even have to be sinister that if the U.S. government is funding this agency, it wants this agency to be carrying out programs that advance and serve the foreign policy of the United States and what the United States perceives to be in the interest of the country. It's not a charity organization. It doesn't rely on private donors. It's funded by the U.S. government. And the reason this was created in the 1960s was because there were a lot of limitations on what agencies like the CIA could do. So if you show up at a foreign country and you say, oh, hi, I'm with the CIA or I'm with the Pentagon, sovereign countries are going to have a lot of limits on what they're going to allow you to do. You're not going to get to go into their country and fund, political programs. They're going to say, we don't want CIA funding in here. But if you show up and you say, oh, we're just an international aid development agency, we're here to help, that is going to open up a lot more doors, and it's going to make people a lot more willing to deal with this agency. So, of course, this agency is an arm of the foreign policy of the United States. I don't think that can be doubted. And there are instances in which you can find programs that do things like provide medication to babies to prevent them from dying of treatable diseases, or providing education in areas where there is none, or other forms of humanitarian aid that you would say, yeah, that is a good, that is an unalloyed good. But even there, the reason the United States is doing that is not because we're really nice and benevolent and want to go around the world helping people. It's because we understand that that's a form of soft power, that we can ingratiate ourselves into those countries. And if we don't do that, it'll be the Chinese that do that, or the Russians who do that. And it's a way of keeping influence in the world. But that is a small part of what USAID does. If you go and talk to most countries. I'm here in Brazil that has a long history of US interference in and even engineering coups against the Brazilian government, support for military dictatorships. Vladimir Putin expelled US aid under the Hillary Clinton's State Department in 2012 because Hillary's State Department was funding and organizing anti-Putin protest opposition groups to the Russian government just 4 years before Russiagate, when we said, oh, how dare Russia interfere in our sacred democracy. We fund groups that are there to overturn governments that are elected, to spread divisiveness and all kinds of conflict in other countries, which is why you saw even left-wing leaders like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, as well as the right-wing president of El Salvador, saying, we don't want USAID in our country. It's a sinister and nefarious program that's designed to subvert our countries for the agenda of the United States. So that part is true. This partisan angle, I don't think is quite as true, because it's not like under the George Bush and Dick Cheney or the Ronald Reagan administration or George H.W. Bush, USAID just shut down. It was also used very aggressively during all of those administrations since its creation in the early 60s in very similar ways. I think the issue that is confusing a lot of people is that over the past 10 years, it has become an instrument of US foreign policy to use, let's call it a woke agenda or a left-wing cultural agenda, to spread America's soft power. So we go into like Ukraine and we fund LGBT groups. We try and make these countries similar to our countries culturally and in terms of their social programs, so that they feel a greater affinity to us than, say, to Russia or to China. And that's why you see all of these programs that look so ideological, funding a trans opera in Peru or whatever. This is all the way that the United States is trying to assert its influence around the world in ways that these countries find quite offensive and quite intrusive. And I do think at some point, you could imagine a situation where soft power is good, where the United States might be wanting to spend money to have influence in a region. But so much of what happens in Washington is you create these agencies with a limited mission, and every year they just grow by inertia. And then suddenly they're this massive behemoths. No one knows what they're doing. They're consuming insane amounts of money. And I do think at some point it has become necessary, and I'm glad it's being done, to kind of open the hood and see what these agencies really are doing, who's running them, who has control over them, and rein in a lot of the things that are either unnecessary or just worse, counterproductive and destructive.
So do you think that targeting USAID by the Trump administration so quickly into his term is simply because this is a function of woke ideology, and the soft power carrot, if you want to call it that, is not really working to advance U.S. interests in the eyes of the Trump administration? Or is there something else going on? In my opinion, and you just look at how China, countries like even Turkey, growing emerging economies utilize soft power. They do it by investing in infrastructure, in human capital, in building hospitals. They don't advance soft power by funding LGBTQ or trans surgeries or some of the other examples that you just laid out. So why is he targeting them? Is it simply because of that, and he wants to replace it, meaning Trump wants to replace it with another instrument to advance U.S. foreign policy, or is there something else going on? Why this rapid attack on it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember an African leader, I forget which one, I have to check, I want to remember, but I remember the quote very well. He said, when the Chinese come to our country, we get a hospital. When the Americans come, we get a lecture. And for all the talk about how imperialistic the Chinese are, the Chinese just want to do business. They just want to, have influence through commercial trade. They don't care at all what these countries are. They don't want to turn, Peru and Uruguay and Argentina into China. They do care if these countries interfere in what China perceives to be its realm of vital interest, Taiwan and Hong Kong. That they care about. But other than that, they don't have the slightest interest in turning these countries into versions of China. They're fine to leave these countries alone and just have influence through commercial trade. Whereas the United States for so long has had this idea that we have to force these countries to become mirror images of the way that we want. And it's not even that we want them to become democracies. We're very happy with tyrannies. We love the Saudis, we love the Emiratis, we love the Egyptians, even though they're all savage, brutal tyrannies, as long as they're serving the interests of the United States. But I think the other component of this, and this is what I have found interesting in this attack on US aid and the reaction to it, is that there is a strong perception on the part of Trump's most influential circle that what primarily sabotaged his first term was that there was this huge part of the government that operated completely unto itself with no responsiveness to the elected leader and the head of the executive branch. And not only are they unresponsive, but they actively sabotaged his administration, which I absolutely believe that is the truth as well.
Yes.
Although that's what they do. They don't really care who gets elected president because they feel like they run things in Washington regardless of who is occupying the White House. And they haven't been wrong about that. And so you see when the people that Donald Trump, who just won a major election, deputized to go in and figure out what does USAID do and where are these payments going and which payments do we stop? The attitude of the people at USAID, just like these other agencies, was you have no right to come in and scrutinize us. You have no right to find out what we're doing. What we do is secret. You have no right to change. They believe that they are a government unto themselves. Yeah. And they are that. That is what they are. That is the definition of a deep state. And I think so much of the planning that was done around Donald Trump and by Donald Trump well before the election, the plan that they wanted to institute, that they needed to institute in the event that he won, which he now has, is to go in and root all of that out. And there's a lot of that going on at USAID. There's other places, including the CIA, obviously, and the FBI, where there's a lot of that too. And I think that is a principal reason why they're doing it. But I also agree with you that a major part of America First foreign policy is that we shouldn't be going into these other countries trying to mold them and shape them to be what we want. That's just not in our interest to do.
One last question on my side. What do you think, in the light of everything we discussed today, is the biggest unreported story in these times?
I think that if you look at our foreign policy, so much of it has been often centered around our alliance with Israel. There's been a lot of wars we fought in the Middle East.
I was thinking about
that Israel has cheered on. There is always talk about us going to wars with various Israeli enemies, including with Iran. President Trump just this week talked about moving the Palestinians, the Arab citizens, out of Gaza, kind of rebuilding it and having the United States own it, and removing those people from Gaza has been a long time dream of the Israelis. And then on top of that, you have the free speech issues with that. I think what Tucker Carlson called a more honest and open discussion about our alliance with Israel, whether it's really in our interest to do all these things to tie ourselves so closely to Israel, I think is really in order. If you look at the farewell addresses of both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they warned and said one of the worst things we could do in foreign policy is have enduring alliances or enemies. You know, we should get along with countries, we should trade with them, but we shouldn't tie ourselves to any country. In a way, I think we've done. And then I also think part of that is the immense power that the U.S. security state continues to wield outside of the democratic processes of our country. And some of these things are getting more attention thanks to the fact that Donald Trump is kind of focused on that, and his administration is. And I think now a lot of the things that have been done by this part of our government that has been operating in secret is going to start to come to light, and hopefully it will now get more reported.
And my final question, Glenn, on this particular topic regarding Gaza. So President Trump has had an unorthodox economic policy where he levies tariffs on both foes and allies as a way to rebalance the global economy. And some would argue that this new vision or outlook on Gaza or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict might actually bear fruits and result in an everlasting peace agreement. Where do you stand on this idea of removing Gaza's 1.7 million to 2 million inhabitants, sending them to countries like Egypt and Jordan, and having the United States, quote unquote, own Gaza? Do you think something like that can result in the long elusive two-state solution? Will it bring a different peace agreement, or is it bound to fail? Where do you stand on this?
I think it's a terrible idea even to trifle with, let alone to pursue. We have to begin with the fact that it isn't like if you live in, say, Ohio or Wisconsin and you get tired of cold weather, you're like, let me leave and go somewhere else, like to Florida or Arizona, where there's these nice. These people are attached to the land because they believe it's holy, it's sacred to them. It's a critical part of their religion, just like it is for the Jews. That's why this conflict has been so intractable, because both of these peoples believe that they have a sacred connection to this land. The chances that, and also I would add to that, that by far the most important thing in Palestinian identity and Palestinian consciousness is what they call the Nakba, in that happened with the formation of the state of Israel in the 1940s, when they were living there.
And they created Israel. United Nations, it's a creation of United Nations.
Right, and the Palestinians were living there, and they got driven out of their homes forcibly with violence. And they consider them that part of Israel to be theirs because it was theirs. The more pragmatic ones accept they're not going to get that back. But at the same time, there's no world in which people who live in Gaza or people who live in the West Bank are just going to peacefully and voluntarily leave the land. Even if the idea is, oh, don't worry, we're going to clean it all out for you, we're going to rebuild it, and then you're going to come back. There's no one in Gaza who believes and who's willing to trust the assurance of the United States and Israel, who just got done destroying all of Gaza for 15 months with no mercy or limits, that they're going to be allowed back in. And so the only way to get the people of Gaza out of Gaza, we're talking about 2 million people, is if somebody goes in with military force and forces them out, basically puts boots on the ground and engages in violence and has an army. And even then it won't be easy, as the Israelis themselves just saw. So, and then at the same time, I think we have to realize that a big part of Donald Trump's vision for peace in the Middle East is that there will be normalization between the Arab Gulf dictators, the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Jordanians and the Bahrainians and the Qataris, and Israel. And the issue is there's no way to have normalized relations between those countries on the one hand and Israel on the other, while the Gazans are sitting in rubble, let alone when they're forced out. Not because these tyrants care so much about the Palestinians, although maybe they do. Their populations care. Their populations will not tolerate, no matter how much you try and repress them. I mean, there's a massive part of Jordan that is Palestinian. They're not going to sit by and watch Palestinians be forced at the barrel of a gun to leave that land and then turn it over to Trump and Miriam Adelson and Jared Kushner to develop, oceanfront golf courses and casinos and hotels without a major conflagration. You're going to blow up the Middle East if you try that. And I'm even worried that talking about it might. It is true what Trump is saying. Gaza is uninhabitable right now. The issue is you have to rebuild it in a way that doesn't force those people out. And I don't really know what his end game is, Trump's. I do believe in Trump's mind, because if it weren't the case that the Palestinians had this very strong, sacred connection to the land, on some level, what Trump is saying is true. Like, hey, they've lived there for all this time. It's never worked. There's always war. Why don't we try something different? Let's, put them somewhere else that they'll have but that's not how it's going to work. And, the only way that there's ever going to be peace in that region is if the Palestinians have sovereignty and have control over their own territory the way that every group of people on the planet want. And, I think Trump deserves credit. He brought about an end to the incessant bombing campaign in a way that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were never able to do. And so he deserves some space and some license for having achieved that. But I think this plan is a very dangerous plan to even discuss, let alone try and pursue.
And what would be actually the potential reaction of the Arab neighbors? So we're discussing about the creation of Israel and the holy significance of these lands to both Palestinian and Jewish people. I think this factor plays a very important role. And also having the United States backing up somehow the small land in the middle of hostility, do you think can be play as a leverage into a potential negotiation for peace? or just
think
something major, very dangerous.
Yeah, I think the most misunderstood thing about Donald Trump among the media and Democrats is that I really do believe he is viscerally and instinctively against war. He's afraid of war.
Yes.
He hates war.
Yes.
I've never heard a leader talk about war in the way Donald Trump does. It's always the first thing he says is about the bloodshed and the horrific loss of human life.
Yes.
It's not just some passing comment. It's the thing he starts with. And he also talks a lot about how dangerous nuclear weapons are, and the threat of nuclear war will be species ending for the planet. And I believe he's really afraid of that as well. And if you look at what Donald Trump is, the art of the deal means is that you get deals done and don't let litigation go to destroy everybody involved. You get a deal done first, and part of that deal
has done it in 10 days. He has done a lot in 10 days already,
including the ceasefire, which absolutely was Donald Trump's doing. I did not expect him to do that. I don't think a lot of people expected that. So I do think he wants to get peace in the Middle East, including among the Palestinians and the Israelis. And he is right that all of the attempts thus far based on this two-state model have failed. It's almost impossible to see how a two-state solution can happen now because Israeli settlers occupy so much of the West Bank, and they themselves have made clear they would not leave and would engage in a civil war against their own government if the Israelis tried to force them to leave the West Bank. So you are going to have a situation, because otherwise you're going to have an apartheid state where the Israeli Jewish minority will rule over the Arab majority of Palestinians and Christians in a way that we decided with South Africa we couldn't tolerate. But I do believe Trump's intentions are to bring about peace. I just think it's going to be a lot more complex than his current plan suggests.
And Glenn, with that, we're so thankful and grateful for your time and for answering all of our questions. Some might have been predictable, some might not have been as predictable. So we're very grateful for your time and for your expertise on so many fascinating topics. Thank you very much. Where can people find you? And if you have a new book or a Substack out, please let our audience know where they could read it and find it and buy it.
Yeah, so we have our nightly show System Update on Rumble, which airs Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern. That's live, usually about 60 to 90 minutes. It's also, there's clips on a bit on YouTube. I generally write my articles on Locals, which is part of the Rumble platform. And then people can find me on X as well under G Greenwald, where I tend to be pretty active and use that platform as well. And I want to congratulate you guys on the launch of your new podcast. There's always room for one more. So I wish you all the success.
Thank you very much for being with us, and we hope to have you back.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Good talking to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Glenn.